The hyper-realistic, recolored footage of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair plays out like a pinnacle of human achievement. Massive, pristine neoclassical palaces and electric lights reflect perfectly in grand, shimmering canals. Now, watch as the entire complex burns to the ground. Your high school textbooks told you this was a temporary plaster city built for a 6-month party, but I am telling you that official narrative is a carefully constructed myth. You have been programmed to accept the mundane explanation, but millions of people right now are waking up to a radically different reality. They look at these ashes and see the deliberate destruction of a global, free energy empire known as Tartaria. They believe a highly advanced civilization was systematically erased from human history, buried under the mud, and rapidly replaced by the highly sterile, easily controlled corporate world we inhabit today. You might instinctively laugh and dismiss these people as crazy, but you are entirely missing the point. If you do not understand how this colossal, open-source delusion was engineered, you are completely defenseless against it. Your brain runs on the exact same ancient dopamine loops and pattern recognition software as theirs. While you mock them, a recommendation algorithm is already quietly rewriting your own perception of political and historical reality. It is time to stop treating the Tartaria phenomenon as a fringe internet joke and start treating it as an active crime scene of the human mind. By dissecting this digital religion, you will receive the ultimate cognitive toolkit. You will understand exactly how mass mythologies are born in the 21st century, and more importantly, you will learn how to protect your own intellect from the algorithms that constantly feed on our collective loneliness and desire for meaning. The infection does not start with a grand revelation. It starts in the dark, illuminated only by the cold, blue glow of a smartphone screen. A tired thumb swipes up. A hypnotic, fast-paced video plays, flashing a 17th-century map of Asia with the word Tartaria stretched massively across it. Quick, aggressive cuts show grand European-style buildings scattered across the Americas. To the cognitive sociologist tracking this data, this is not just a video. It is patient zero. Through the sociologist's eyes, that exhausted face in the dark room represents a profound vulnerability in human neurobiology. The viewer is experiencing a manufactured epiphany, a sudden rush of dopamine triggered by the illusion of discovering forbidden knowledge. The sociologist watches the engagement metrics spike in real time, witnessing the exact moment a viral cognitive virus hijacks a legitimate historical quirk to birth a completely new, alternative historical reality. The foundation of this new reality rests on a spectacular misunderstanding of antique maps. To European cartographers of the 16th and 17th centuries, the word Tartaria was never the name of a unified, utopian superpower. It was simply a geographic placeholder, a convenient label born of pure ignorance. It was the absolute equivalent of writing the phrase, "Here be dragons," over the vast, uncharted, and deeply misunderstood steppes of northern Asia. Those immense stretches of land were actually inhabited by incredibly diverse, fiercely independent nomadic groups with their own complex cultures. But a cartographer sitting in a damp London or Paris office did not have satellites or reconnaissance data. They had empty space on a piece of parchment, and human nature abhors a vacuum. So they elegantly masked their lack of geographical knowledge with a single, sweeping word, never predicting the paradox it would create centuries later. However, the modern recommendation algorithm does not care about historical nuance or the distinct limitations of Renaissance mapmakers. It only cares about watch time and human engagement. By the year 2021, videos tagged with the word Tartaria on major social platforms had surpassed 800 million views. Let that terrifying number sink in. 800 million data points where a simple cartographic label was forcibly transmuted into a fully fleshed-out civilization. The code found a weak spot in our collective psyche and ruthlessly exploited it. It fed those 800 million views with increasingly elaborate architectural fantasies, stripping images of real 19th-century buildings from their historical context. The algorithm acted as a blind, unthinking architect, collaboratively building a mythological empire with millions of isolated users, proving that a lie repeated by a machine quickly becomes an undeniable digital truth. But every good conspiracy requires a smoking gun, a piece of irrefutable classified evidence to cement the paranoia. The algorithm delivered exactly that. In 1998, the Central Intelligence Agency declassified a fascinating internal document. This specific report explicitly outlined how the Soviet Union systematically erased the cultural history and local languages of an Islamic region historically known by that exact same cursed name, Tartaria. To a historian, this document is a tragic record of 20th-century Soviet cultural suppression in places like modern Tatarstan. But to a mind already primed by the algorithm, this declassified file was the ultimate vindication. The conspiracy theorists found this document and instantly weaponized it. Through their warped lens, the Central Intelligence Agency was officially admitting to a massive global cover-up of a technologically supreme, worldwide utopian empire. You see the brilliant, terrifying paradox here. The Internet took a mundane 16th-century map-maker's placeholder, smashed it into a tragic 20th-century geopolitical report about Soviet censorship, and forged an entirely new, imaginary timeline. It is a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. Millions of people are now absolutely convinced that the grand post offices and courthouses in their own downtowns were built by a lost civilization that never actually existed. We are standing on the precipice of a mass psychological event, watching human history being rewritten in real time by engagement metrics and server farms. The Tartaria phenomenon forces us to ask deeply uncomfortable questions about what is real, and how easily our perception of reality can be hijacked by a few lines of code and a profound sense of societal alienation. The trap has been perfectly set, and millions have already willingly walked right into the digital cage. Which brings us to the ultimate, inescapable anomaly that we must confront before we can dive deeper into the physical evidence they claim to find in our streets. If this was all just a massive algorithmic hallucination born from antique maps and lonely scrolling, we have to look closer at that classified file. Why did the Central Intelligence Agency declassify a document mentioning the erasure of Tartaria in 1998? And what is the real secret buried inside it? You are asking the wrong question about that classified file. The truth of the Central Intelligence Agency document was already laid bare. It was about Soviet censorship, a geopolitical tragedy, not a buried utopia. But the map and the documents were only the theoretical seeds. To understand how this digital religion truly breached reality, we have to step away from the archives and look at the physical proof these followers claim to find in your own neighborhood. I am standing on a modern city street, watching a man point his trembling smartphone camera at the basement windows of a 19th-century brownstone. The camera pans across the brickwork, zooming in on the fact that these windows are inexplicably cut off, sitting exactly half below the concrete sidewalk. To your untrained eye, it is just a quirky architectural compromise. But to his algorithmically radicalized mind, it is the ultimate glitch in the matrix. He is looking right at the anomaly of the basement. Why are the ground floors of so many historic buildings seemingly buried underground, their grand arches slicing straight into the pavement? You have probably walked past thousands of them and never bothered to ask. But this man is speaking frantically into his camera, broadcasting to millions that these sunken windows are the smoking gun. He believes he is documenting the aftermath of an apocalyptic cover-up. Welcome to the cornerstone of the entire delusion. The core physical evidence for the Tartaria myth is what they call the mud flood. According to the Internet's collaborative mythology, a deliberate, cataclysmic deluge of soil wiped out the utopian empire in the mid-19th century. This catastrophic weapon of mass erasure supposedly buried the magnificent first floors of grand, free-energy palaces under several feet of dirt, resetting civilization. Your high school history teacher failed you by making the 19th century sound incredibly boring. Because the true explanation for these buried windows is a marvel of human engineering that makes the Internet's apocalyptic fairy tale look intellectually lazy. The reality is far more brutal and far more heroic. We are not looking at the ruins of a buried utopia. We are looking at the desperate survival tactics of a species on the brink of biological collapse. During the intense urbanization of the Industrial Revolution, our cities were literally drowning in their own filth. Human waste, horse manure, and industrial runoff turned unpaved streets into toxic swamps. The consequence was inevitable and terrifying. Devastating outbreaks of cholera. The water supply was poisoned. The paradox here is striking. Our ancestors were not living in a clean, harmonious golden age. They were dying in droves from microscopic pathogens. To combat this invisible slaughter, municipal governments had to execute urban terraforming projects on a scale that defies modern comprehension. They realized they needed to install comprehensive gravity-fed sewer systems to pull the contaminated waste away from the drinking water. But gravity requires a slope, and cities built on flat swampland possessed zero natural elevation. You cannot just lay pipes in the mud. You have to fundamentally alter the geography. This brings us to the ultimate counterintuitive triumph of the 1850s. The entire city of Chicago was literally jacked up into the air. They did not have laser levels or hydraulic cranes. Instead, brilliant, soot-covered engineers coordinated the synchronous turning of thousands of manual screw jacks. They lifted entire blocks of massive, multi-story masonry buildings, hotels, and retail stores, raising them incrementally while business continued inside. Some of these colossal brick and stone structures were elevated by an astonishing 14 feet. Once the buildings were suspended, laborers rushed in to build new foundation walls underneath them, and then millions of cubic yards of dirt were hauled in to raise the level of the streets to match. The original ground floors were not buried by an ancient cataclysm. They simply became the new basements. The anomaly in the sidewalk is just a scar of our own ingenuity. So when the man with the smartphone points at a half-buried window and screams that history is a lie, he is insulting the very laborers who saved his ancestors from cholera. He is staring right at a monumental victory of human resilience and fundamentally misreading the data. The algorithmic lens has completely inverted reality. It took the greatest public health and engineering triumph of the 19th century and rebranded it as a malicious dystopian conspiracy. This is where the sheer visionary power of the Tartaria illusion becomes terrifyingly clear. We desperately want to believe that humans were once capable of effortless magic, because acknowledging the immense, back-breaking labor required to build the modern world is exhausting. It is so much easier for your brain to accept a suppressed empire of clean energy than to visualize thousands of men turning heavy iron screws in the freezing mud to defeat a bacterial plague. We did not dig those buildings out of the aftermath of a mythological flood. We deliberately buried their foundations to save our own lives from the very real filth of early industrialization. The mud flood is nothing but a phantom menace, a digital ghost story superimposed over the raw, magnificent struggle of urban development. But as comforting as this engineering explanation is, the believers have another piece of evidence that is much harder to simply brush away. While the sunken basements can be explained by municipal sewage and screwjacks, the believers inevitably point their cameras toward the sky. They look at the archival photographs of the colossal, pristine palaces from the late 19th century and ask an entirely different question. If we were so busy fighting cholera in the mud, how did we simultaneously construct impossibly grand, classical capitals in just a matter of months? The real illusion is about to begin. If the basements of our cities were just massive, terrifying sewage projects, what about the impossible, gleaming palaces that theorists say were the true capitals of Tartaria? Look closely at this archival, jittery film footage of the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Massive, Romanesque columns and domes stretch all the way to the horizon, glowing with an otherworldly perfection. It looks like a capital built for gods, right here in the American Midwest. To the architectural historian sitting exhausted in the dusty basement of a municipal archive, surrounded by fragile 19th-century blueprints, this footage is deeply frustrating. You look at these sepia photographs and your modern intuition completely short-circuits. How could a society that still relied on horse-drawn carriages build an entirely new Rome in just 2 years? This is the ultimate anomaly that fuels the digital religion of Tartaria. The believers point to these monumental world fairs and proudly declare that humans of the Gilded Age simply lacked the industrial technology to construct them so quickly. According to the algorithm, we did not build these pristine neoclassical cities. We merely inherited them from a highly advanced, suppressed global empire. The logic feels incredibly seductive when you stare at millions of square feet of flawless masonry that seemingly appeared overnight. You are programmed to assume that grand, classical architecture equals centuries of grueling labor and solid, immovable stone. The visual evidence feels absolutely irrefutable to the untrained eye. We see a photograph of a colossal domed palace and immediately equate it with the permanence of the Vatican or the Capitol building. But your eyes are lying to you, and the Internet's recommendation engines are happily monetizing that exact biological miscalculation. Let us go back into that jittery archival footage from St. Louis and zoom in very closely on one of those majestic Roman columns. You see a laborer standing on a wooden scaffold, chipping away at the surface. That is not a master mason carving a block of solid marble. The gleaming white facade is literally flaking off to reveal a skeletal, splintered wooden frame underneath. The grand illusion of the lost empire instantly crumbles into dust and wood shavings. The grand secret of the World Fairs is an industrial material known as staff. It was a cheap, highly malleable and fast-drying mixture of plaster of Paris intertwined with hemp fiber. These magnificent buildings were not the ancient, inherited palaces of a lost global civilization. They were colossal, temporary stage sets built rapidly over simple timber frames. It was the architectural equivalent of a Hollywood movie backdrop, scaled up to cover entire cities. The exhausted historian in the archive holds the original blueprints that prove this was a masterclass in theatrical deception, not ancient magic. We engineered an illusion of immense weight and historical permanence, using materials that cost almost nothing. The goal was to dazzle the public, to create a fleeting sense of utopian wonder, and to do it on a strict, unbreakable budget. We did not need anti-gravity technology. We just needed thousands of immigrant laborers and a lot of plaster. But if they were just stage sets, why did we destroy them so violently? This brings us to the next massive pillar of the conspiracy. Tartaria theorists watch footage of the world fairs being torn down or burning to the ground, and they see a malicious erasure of history. They see a victorious cabal intentionally wiping out the last remaining evidence of a superior, free energy society. The truth, however, is far more cynical and deeply rooted in modern economics. The destruction of these magnificent plaster cities was not an orchestrated cultural genocide. It was a cold, calculated financial necessity. The massive tracts of land used for the fairs were strictly leased, and the clock was always ticking. To recoup the exorbitant costs of throwing a 6-month party for the entire world, the salvage rights were immediately sold to aggressive demolition companies. The moment the fair ended, the teardown was legally mandated to begin. Furthermore, these structures were practically designed to self-destruct. A massive skeletal wooden frame coated in dry hemp and plaster is essentially a giant, highly flammable tinderbox. Leaving them standing was not just an economic impossibility. It was a catastrophic fire hazard for the surrounding host cities. These gleaming monuments were engineered from their very conception to last exactly 6 months, and not a single day longer. You have to understand what these world fairs actually represented. They were not the dying gasps of a majestic, forgotten civilization. They were the aggressive, triumphant birth of American consumer capitalism, cleverly disguised in the comforting aesthetic of classical antiquity. We built a fake Rome out of plaster to sell electric toasters, new agricultural machinery, and the glittering promise of a mechanized future. It was a marketing stunt of unprecedented scale. By choosing to believe in the myth of a stolen empire, you are inadvertently committing a profound act of disrespect. You are erasing the real, blistered hands of the laborers, carpenters, and plasterers who worked grueling shifts to build a temporary wonderland. The algorithmic fantasy robs humanity of its own spectacular, theatrical ingenuity. We do not need a magical past to be impressive. The real history of our industrial ambition is wild enough on its own. We have pulled back the curtain on the disposable plaster palaces, proving that the monumental architecture was a brilliant economic illusion. But the algorithm has another trap waiting. Even if the buildings were temporary, the believers focus intensely on what was sitting on top of those grand, fake domes. Because those intricate metal spires were supposedly doing something far more dangerous than just looking pretty. They were supposedly pulling free power straight out of the sky. The world fairs were temporary, but the algorithmic obsession with their majestic domes leads us directly to the most dangerous and seductive part of this entire myth, the promise of infinite, free energy. Look at the sky above a Gothic cathedral as a massive thunderstorm rolls in. Lightning strikes the ornate metal finial right at the very top of the dome, and for a fraction of a second, the entire structure becomes a conduit for raw, unbridled cosmic power. To the untrained eye, that lightning strike is just extreme weather. But to millions of people trapped in the algorithmic loop, It is a suppressed technological truth. The core tenet of the Tartaria theory insists that classical domes, obelisks, and intricate metal finials were never merely decorative architectural choices. They believe these towering structures were actually functioning high-tech antennas, deliberately designed to extract free, wireless energy. They argue this lost civilization pulled limitless power directly from the atmospheric ether. We are looking at a beautifully complex diagram from Maxwell's era, visualizing invisible, sweeping waves in this supposed ether. It is a stunning, deeply romantic concept of the universe. The idea that the air around us is practically vibrating with an ocean of free, clean electricity, just waiting to be harvested. But modern physics equations tear the ether concept apart with brutal mathematical precision. Here is the ultimate paradox. The reason this specific myth is so incredibly infectious. It is actually based on a very real, very measurable scientific phenomenon. Atmospheric electricity is not a fairy tale. You have been taught that the air is empty, but your high school textbooks oversimplified the reality of the invisible forces surrounding you right now. There is a continuous natural voltage gradient existing in the open air all around us. For every single meter you move upward from the surface of the Earth, the electrical potential increases by roughly 100 volts. If you are standing outside, the space right at the top of your head is literally humming with a potential of nearly 200 volts compared to the ground beneath your feet. It sounds like absolute magic, does it not? This invisible gradient is the very mechanism that drives the believers to look at a towering 300-foot cathedral spire and see a massive power plant. They correctly identify the voltage, and they logically assume that ancient architects were simply building giant, conductive spikes to tap into this atmospheric battery. It is a brilliant deduction, except it completely ignores the unforgiving laws of energy density. You see, having high voltage is completely useless if you do not have the current to back it up. Voltage is just the pressure, but current, the actual amperage flowing through the system, is what does the real heavy lifting. And the natural current flowing downward through our atmosphere is infinitesimally small. We are talking about picoamperes per square meter. It is a microscopic trickle of electrons descending from the sky, not a rushing electrical river. You could construct a massive conductive copper wire and stretch it hundreds of feet high into the atmosphere, exactly like the grandest spires of the old world. You would indeed tap into thousands of volts of electrical potential. But if you tried to harness that power, you would barely scrape together enough microamperes to faintly glow a single, tiny light-emitting diode. You certainly could not run a high-speed rail network or illuminate a global metropolis. The rigid mathematical physics of energy density absolutely forbid the possibility of powering an advanced mechanized empire with nothing but decorative copper domes and atmospheric static. To power a single modern toaster, you would need an antenna array so impossibly large it would blot out the sun. The architects of the 19th century were not building wireless power grids. They were building monuments to their faith and their newfound industrial wealth. So why does this algorithmic lie survive the undeniable crushing weight of basic physics? Because this is not a debate about thermodynamics anymore. It is a desperate, psychological cry for a better future. When a modern citizen looks at their soaring electric bills, the pollution choking their city, and a power grid entirely dependent on extracting and burning fossil fuels, the concept of clean, limitless energy feels like a stolen, forgotten birthright. We have engineered a society that feels completely sterile and entirely out of our control. The Tartaria narrative is a visionary, collaborative attempt by modern, alienated humans to write a new mythology. They are projecting their deep yearning for a utopian, post-scarcity world backward into the 19th century. They are looking at old photographs and seeing the sustainable, beautiful future we were promised, but never actually received. And the social media algorithms feed relentlessly on this tragic optimism. The code does not care about James Clerk Maxwell or the microamperes of the atmospheric gradient. It only measures the massive dopamine spike that occurs when a user suddenly feels that the universe is magical again. The algorithm weaponizes our innate desire for wonder, serving up endless hours of architectural pareidolia to keep us scrolling through a beautifully fabricated past. The ultimate irony is that our actual ancestors did figure out how to harness electricity during this exact same time period. They built massive, roaring hydroelectric dams and strung millions of miles of copper wire across continents. They dragged humanity out of the Dark Ages through grueling, dangerous, and brilliantly calculated engineering. But that harsh, industrial reality is just not as aesthetically pleasing as a magical, wireless utopia. Standing beneath the shadow of a Gothic cathedral, you can almost understand the temptation to believe the lie. It is deeply comforting to imagine that perfection was once achieved and merely stolen from us, rather than accepting the terrifying truth that utopia is something we still have to painfully construct ourselves. The domes were never whispering with free energy. They were always just silent sentinels, watching us struggle to illuminate the darkness. We have shattered the physics of the free energy delusion, proving that the sky was never a wireless battery. But this brings us to a much darker realization. If the architecture was temporary, and the infinite power is mathematically impossible, how did this mathematically disproven fantasy manage to infect hundreds of millions of minds in less than a decade? To solve that, we have to look away from the clouds and stare directly into the terrifying architecture of the code. We are used to looking for conspiracies in the shadows of history, in the dusty archives of the 19th century, or in the silent copper domes of the world fairs. But tomorrow's empires are not built with stone or steel. They are constructed with lines of code. If the physics and the architecture debunk the Tartaria theory completely, why did this myth suddenly explode into the mainstream in the 2020s? The answer is not in the clouds. It is humming right here, inside the server racks. To the cognitive sociologist monitoring these multi-screen dashboards, the global internet traffic heat map is not just a routing diagram. It is a live pulse of human vulnerability. When we overlay this data traffic onto a three-dimensional model of the human brain, a terrifying, beautiful symmetry emerges. We're watching a piece of content go viral in real time. Pulses of light flash across the fiber optic cables, and simultaneously, the limbic system of the collective viewer lights up like a Christmas tree. Every single upward swipe of a thumb floods the brain's reward centers with a concentrated dose of dopamine. This brings us to the ultimate paradox of our digital age, the engagement trap. How exactly did a mathematically disproven fringe architectural hypothesis manage to infect tens of millions of minds simultaneously, all without a single central leader, a manifesto, or a physical headquarters? You were taught that cults require charismatic dictators. You were programmed with outdated high school sociology. The official narrative suggests that people simply became gullible, that the education system failed, and that the masses are easily fooled by cheap video editing. This is a comforting misconception, and it is entirely wrong. The spread of the Tartaria myth is not a failure of public schooling. It is a flawless, textbook example of algorithmic radicalization working exactly as it was designed to. You are not witnessing a degradation of intelligence. You are witnessing a hostile takeover of human perception. The recommendation engines powering our primary video platforms do not possess a moral compass. They do not optimize for historical truth, scientific accuracy, or societal well-being. They optimize for a single ruthless metric: maximum watch time. Through billions of micro-interactions, the neural networks discovered a devastating psychological exploit. They learned that the concept of a stolen, hidden history triggers a remarkably powerful, self-sustaining emotional loop within the human mind. It begins with a single, seemingly innocuous interaction. A user pauses for 3 extra seconds on a video analyzing the unusually deep basement windows of a Chicago brownstone. To the human, it is a moment of mild curiosity. To the machine learning model, it is a definitive behavioral signal. The algorithm instantly categorizes this user and begins silently altering the architectural layout of their digital reality. The trap springs shut before the conscious mind even registers a threat. Once this initial engagement is logged, the algorithm aggressively filters the user's feed to maximize retention. It strips away dissenting opinions, architectural history, and basic physics. What emerges is a phenomenon sociologists call false consensus. Every time this person opens their phone, they are greeted by hundreds of high-definition videos, thousands of validating comments, and a seamless stream of content confirming that the mud flood is an undeniable, empirical reality. We are no longer dealing with a simple echo chamber. We are dealing with a hermetically sealed epistemic bubble. Within days, 99% of the user's incoming informational diet serves only to reinforce the myth. This overwhelming volume of manufactured consensus effectively overwrites their baseline reality. When everyone in your digital village insists the sky is green, your biological hardware eventually overrides your own eyes to maintain social cohesion. This is the exact moment that digital religion is born. The algorithm has successfully bypassed the prefrontal cortex and rewritten the foundational code of human belief. It is a terrifying testament to our own cognitive fragility. If this scale of algorithmic manipulation blows your mind too, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Let me know in the comments if you think our Paleolithic brains ever stood a chance against these trillion-parameter recommendation engines. It is deeply counterintuitive, but the followers of the Tartaria theory are not passive victims of a malicious computer program. They are active, enthusiastic co-authors in a massive, open-source science fiction project. The artificial intelligence merely provides the scaffolding, while human longing provides the brick and mortar. The algorithm discovered our profound societal loneliness and monetized our desperate search for a more beautiful, structurally sound universe. You look at a believer pointing a smartphone at a plaster column, and you feel superior. You think your reality tunnel is somehow more objective, but that is the most dangerous delusion of all. The exact same recommendation matrix that built the phantom empire of Tartaria is currently curating your political views, your economic anxieties, and your cultural outrage. The code simply tailored a different psychological exploit to fit your specific demographic profile. We must stop viewing this phenomenon as a mere glitch in the matrix or a bizarre internet joke. Tartaria is a mirror reflecting the immense, untapped visionary potential of the modern human mind. Millions of isolated individuals have spontaneously coordinated across continents to collaboratively engineer an entirely new planetary timeline. If we can unpack the mechanics of this mass delusion, we acquire the ultimate cognitive toolkit to understand how all mythologies are born. The true threat is not that people believe a 19th-century world fair was a utopian capital. The threat is that our primary mechanisms for discovering truth have been outsourced to opaque mathematical models that prioritize engagement over enlightenment. The algorithm is the invisible architect of our new dark age, constructing infinite, personalized labyrinths where facts are infinitely malleable and emotional resonance is the only currency that actually matters. We trace the signal from a single flashing node on the server room dashboard, representing one lonely user swiping through their feed at 2 a.m, all the way out to the macro scale of a shifting global consciousness. The human brain, evolved to navigate the African savanna, is fundamentally outmatched by the relentless, iterative perfection of the feed. We built a machine to connect us, and it decided to rewrite our past instead. But to fully grasp the devastating power of this algorithmic spell, we have to ask why the mind is so eager to accept the lie in the first place. The code only exploits existing vulnerabilities. It cannot create the hunger. It can only feed it. The true root of the Tartaria infection is not technological, but deeply emotional. It is a profound, unhealed psychological wound that forces us to look at the modern concrete world around us and feel utterly, irreversibly alienated. Algorithms only exploit existing vulnerabilities, as I noted before. To truly understand this cognitive infection, we must rip open the psychological wound it entered through. We are accustomed to measuring civilizational collapse through economic crashes or rising sea levels, but the real apocalypse is entirely aesthetic. The ugliness of the modern world is the petri dish where this delusion thrives. I stand before a massive, brutalist concrete parking garage, watching its cold geometry transition into a sterile, glass and steel corporate skyscraper. A single pedestrian walks by the sheer, featureless wall, looking utterly small and alienated. This is the physical manifestation of modern depression. You have to ask yourself the forbidden question: why do you desperately want to believe your ancestors were inherently better than you? Your university professors likely taught you that modern architecture represents the ultimate triumph of rational efficiency over frivolous decoration. You were programmed to accept this sterile grid as the pinnacle of human progress. But that official narrative is a carefully constructed myth. What you are actually looking at is an environment that is actively hostile to your basic human neurology. The Tartaria phenomenon is simply a symptom of a highly documented, yet rarely discussed psychological condition known as solastalgia. First identified by environmental philosophers in the early 2000s, solastalgia is the profound existential distress caused by the negative transformation of your immediate home environment. It is the crushing homesickness you experience when you have not even left your house. We usually apply this diagnosis to populations displaced by strip mining or extreme climate events. But I am applying it to you right now as you navigate your own city. When historic, human-scale neighborhoods are demolished to make way for monolithic commercial zones, the collective unconscious of the population suffers a massive, unacknowledged trauma. You are alienated in your own streets. To find the true killer, we must look at the timeline. In the decades immediately following World War II, the global architectural paradigm suffered a catastrophic shift. We abandoned centuries of organic design and embraced brutalism and the rigid, unforgiving lines of the international style. But do not be fooled by the academic labels. This was not a noble artistic evolution, it was a brutal financial equation. The eradication of classical ornamentation was a calculated move to maximize corporate profit per square foot. Gargoyles, intricate cornices, and soaring arches cost massive amounts of time and highly skilled labor. Poured concrete and prefabricated glass panels are cheap, fast, and infinitely scalable. We traded the soul of our civic spaces for a temporary spike in the quarterly earnings of multinational developers. The resulting built environment became aggressively utilitarian. We stopped building monuments to human potential and started constructing massive, windowless concrete boxes designed solely to warehouse human capital and inventory. Your brain evolved to seek out the complex, fractal patterns of the natural world, is starved of visual nutrition when forced to stare at an unbroken expanse of gray corporate concrete. Consider the brutal contrast that confronts you every single day. Analyze archival photographs of a breathtaking, intricately carved 19th-century post office, a building meant to honor the simple act of human communication. Now compare that masterpiece to the modern, corrugated metal Amazon fulfillment center where you actually spend your time. The aesthetic downgrade is violently abrupt. When your citizen brain processes that specific comparison, it experiences a profound, measurable sense of grief. It is entirely counterintuitive to the narrative of constant progress. You have smartphones and fast internet, yet your physical reality is demonstrably uglier and cheaper than the world your great-grandparents inhabited. This cognitive dissonance creates a vacuum, and the mind demands an explanation. This is the exact moment the realization hits you. The Tartaria myth is not a failure of the education system. It is a desperate, visionary coping mechanism to explain this aesthetic degradation. If the world is getting progressively uglier despite massive technological advancement, the traumatized mind concludes that a superior civilization must have been deliberately murdered and replaced by corporate parasites. You mock the theorists for believing in a phantom empire, but their core diagnosis of the modern condition is terrifyingly accurate. They are looking at the same sterile plazas and oppressive parking structures that you are, but they refuse to accept them as normal. The conspiracy theory is merely a protective psychological shell wrapped around a very real, very justified artistic rebellion against modernity. I have watched the recommendation algorithms weaponize this grief, turning a shared sense of loss into a fully operational digital religion. The code figured out that showing you a demolished Victorian mansion next to a modern strip mall triggers a massive spike in engagement. Anger and nostalgia are the twin engines driving this alternate reality, powered entirely by the undeniable ugliness of late-stage capitalism. The people crafting these algorithmic fairy tales are not looking backward because they hate the future. They are doing it because the future they were promised has been completely sterilized. They demand the beauty that was engineered out of the municipal budget. By inventing a past where architecture was a sacred duty, they are forcing us to confront the undeniable poverty of our modern imagination. We have allowed our physical world to become an endless series of profit-driven compromises, and the resulting psychological blowback has fractured our shared timeline. The grand illusion of Tartaria is a mirror held up to the crime of brutalism. We are so starved for aesthetic meaning that millions of people would rather believe in a deleted magical empire than accept the dreary, concrete reality we actually built. We have dismantled the architectural myth, tearing down the plaster columns and the misunderstood physics. But we absolutely cannot dismiss its raw, psychological power. Because the moment you stop laughing at the absurdity of the mud flood, you realize something profound. Tartaria is no longer just a debunked theory about an erased past. It is a meticulously constructed blueprint for our own future. Look closely at the data streams through the eyes of the cognitive sociologist. On the primary monitor, a highly idealized virtual simulation of a Tartarian city glows with impossible perfection. Avatars in classical robes wander through lush, integrated greenery, while levitating airships drift silently overhead. It is a breathtaking digital utopia, running entirely on a humming, decidedly non-magical server rack in the background of the laboratory. The paradox here shatters everything you thought you knew about how the internet breeds misinformation. We are trained to view every online rabbit hole as a malicious psychological trap. But what if this specific anomaly is different? What if Tartaria is not a toxic conspiracy theory designed to tear society apart, but the exact opposite? What if we are witnessing the real-time, algorithmic birth of a completely new religion? The traditional architecture of a conspiracy is entirely rooted in paranoia and fear. You are taught that secret cabals are trying to microchip you, poison your water, or collapse the global economy. But the Tartaria hypothesis fundamentally rewrites that code. It is an aggressively optimistic narrative. It posits that humanity is naturally capable of living in absolute peace, aesthetic harmony, and complete post-scarcity. You were programmed to believe that human history is a bloody climb out of the brutal mud, a constant struggle for dwindling resources. The algorithms feeding the Tartarian myth offer a radical counter-narrative. They tell the exhausted modern citizen that our default state is not war or poverty, but grace. The sociologist watching these engagement metrics spike realizes this is not a history lesson. It is a collective prayer. We are not looking at the work of a single cult leader or a shadowy geopolitical operative. We are watching millions of deeply isolated individuals collaboratively writing an open-source mythology. Every uploaded video, every shared rendering of a domed palace, adds another verse to a sacred text. They are projecting their desperate desires for free energy and universal basic income backward in time, anchoring them in a fake 19th century. Inside the glowing simulation on the lab monitor, there are no billboards, no traffic jams, and no windowless fulfillment centers. The sociologist tracks the eye movements of the users navigating this space. They linger on the ornate stonework and the impossible crystalline water features. This digital hallucination provides a therapeutic refuge from the sensory deprivation of the modern metropolis. You think these people are simply confused about when the elevator was invented, or how a municipal sewer system functions? That is your own intellectual blind spot. The past is merely a convenient, unprovable canvas. By insisting that this golden age was stolen from them, they're actually granting themselves permission to demand it back. The fiction of an erased empire is just the delivery mechanism for a radical political demand. This entire phenomenon represents the ultimate subconscious rebellion against late-stage capitalism. The modern economic engine demands endless extraction and aesthetic compromise, offering a future of subscription models and rented air. By inventing a historical timeline where atmospheric energy was entirely free and architectural beauty was a universal human right, They are inadvertently drafting a manifesto. They are not trying to resurrect the 1800s. They are outlining the exact utopian goals that humanity must strive for in the 21st century. The illusion of Tartaria is a mirror reflecting our deepest developmental failures. The people sharing these videos are demanding sustainable infrastructure, equitable power grids, and cities built for human psychological well-being rather than corporate efficiency. The hum of the server rack in the laboratory is the sound of cold, hard reality calculating the cost of this dream. The algorithm does not care about the utopian vision. It only cares about the retention rate. It monetizes the user's longing for a better world, serving them advertisements for cryptocurrency and survival gear right alongside the levitating airships and the marble courtyards. Here is the paradox you must swallow. The official narrative tells you that the current system of hyper-consumption is the only rational way to organize a civilization. The believers in the mud flood are technically wrong about the facts, but they are absolutely right about the trajectory. They have correctly diagnosed that a society incapable of building beautiful, lasting monuments is a society already in terminal decline. Never underestimate the raw, kinetic power of a collaborative fiction. Every major civilization was built on a foundational myth, a shared story that convinced millions of strangers to cooperate. The cognitive sociologist recognizes that this algorithmic folklore operates on the exact same neurological hardware as the ancient epics. It is a new pantheon of gods, rendered in high-definition video and delivered straight to the limbic system. You cannot combat this digital religion with dry fact checks about 19th-century plaster. When you throw a textbook at a starving person, you do not cure their hunger. If we want to dismantle the seductive power of the Tartaria illusion, we have to actually build the world they are dreaming of. We must transform their open-source science fiction into concrete, steel, and actualized urban policy. The simulation on the monitor slowly fades to black, leaving only the reflection of the tired researcher on the glass. The myth has done its job. It has exposed the deep structural cracks in our modern reality. We are standing at a civilizational crossroads, clutching a fake map to a non-existent empire, desperately hoping it will somehow guide us out of the very real wasteland we created. That fake map in your hands points nowhere, but the human desire that drew it is the most undeniably real force on this planet. Look out over any modern city at twilight. The stone facades of the 19th century stand shoulder to shoulder with the glass and steel monoliths of the 21st. We built this. But as the streetlights flicker on across the grid, it is impossible to ignore the profound sense of loss radiating from the concrete. We have spent this entire journey dissecting a digital religion. We exposed the plaster palaces, the misread maps, and the mathematical impossibility of atmospheric energy. You now understand that the Tartarian utopia is entirely fictional. But the lesson of this class is not simply to debunk a viral myth and walk away. The lesson is to recognize what this massive, collaborative delusion reveals about the architecture of our own minds. The true tragedy of the Tartaria phenomenon is that it steals credit from the very real humans of the 19th century. By attributing our grandest architectural achievements to a magical, lost civilization, we erase the laborers who actually broke their backs in the mud. They swung the hammers, poured the iron, and operated the screwjacks that lifted entire cities out of the cholera-infested swamps. They were not magicians. They were survivors. When you credit a mythical empire for the beauty of the old world, you strip humanity of its most important triumph. The classical post offices and intricate cathedrals were not inherited from a golden age. They were forged by people who lived without antibiotics, working by the light of whale oil lamps. They built monuments to outlast their own fragile lives. We desperately need to reclaim that specific, gritty ambition, rather than mourning a fantasy. The algorithm did not create the mud flood conspiracy out of thin air. Code cannot generate human longing. It can only reflect and amplify our deep, collective exhaustion. We are a society starved for beauty, trapped in hostile, utilitarian architecture designed exclusively for corporate profit. When a recommendation engine feeds you a vision of a harmonious, ornate world, it is simply exploiting your legitimate grief for the environment we threw away. That same algorithm weaponizes your entirely rational terror regarding the global energy crisis. We look at our fragile, fossil fuel-dependent grid and feel utterly powerless to change the trajectory. The myth of wireless atmospheric electricity is a psychological painkiller. It is infinitely easier for the human brain to believe that unlimited, clean power was stolen from us by a secret cabal than to face the staggering thermodynamic challenges of our reality. But here is the visionary truth you must take away from this investigation. Millions of isolated individuals are collaboratively writing an open-source blueprint for a post-scarcity society. By inventing a past where energy was free, architecture was universally beautiful, and humanity lived in harmony, they are inadvertently drafting the exact utopian goals we must strive for tomorrow. The Tartaria myth is a massive, decentralized manifesto for human survival. Are we destined to keep inventing fake pasts just to survive the future? Only if we refuse to take responsibility for the present. The undeniable axiom of history is that we are the authors of our own reality. The energy required to sustain this massive digital delusion is the exact same energy required to fundamentally redesign our urban centers. We have to stop using our unmatched technological capacity to simulate better worlds and start using it to build them. This is where your intellectual homework begins. If this investigation has dismantled the illusion and given you a new framework for reality, hit the like button. That metric tells our own algorithms that we are successfully breaking through the noise. Subscribe to this channel, not just to watch another documentary, but to join a community dedicated to analyzing the true mechanics of our civilization. The research continues, and we need your mind engaged. As we pull back into the upper atmosphere, the glowing grid of humanity stretches out in the darkness. There are no lost empires buried beneath that soil. There is only us, armed with the accumulated knowledge of 13.8 billion years of cosmic evolution, standing on the precipice of a new era. The world looks chaotic, hostile, and broken, but it is precisely in the ruins of our old certainties that the foundation for tomorrow must be poured. The ultimate truth is that the utopia you are searching for was never lost to a flood of mud. It simply has not been built yet. The responsibility for creating a society defined by lasting beauty and sustainable power falls squarely on our shoulders, and the time for escaping into algorithmic fantasies has passed. Now you know the truth of the world. Live with it and start building. Class dismissed.